So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about Ebola. One of the reasons that it took me a little bit longer to post this lecture is because I deviated from my normal lesson plan and from the book and went into the media, the literature, and popular press and pulled out things about Ebola virus because I thought that learning about that was going to be more interesting and more relevant than going through standard textbook stuff. So we're leaving the textbook and we're going to talk a little bit about Ebola. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of background. Ebola was first discovered in 1976 in Zaire. And what happened was a school teacher returned from a hike and went to the doctor because of a high fever, and the doctor thought that he had malaria. So a week later, he had terrible symptoms: uncontrolled vomiting, bloody diarrhea, trouble breathing, and bleeding from multiple orifices. And he died about 14 days after the onset of symptoms. So this particular case started an epidemic that killed 280 of the 313 people infected. So an alarmingly high mortality rate of 88%. Now, I found this graphic that talks a little bit about the typical path through a human being. There are pictures on the internet that show actual infected people, but I wanted to do this to show a little bit of respect for the victims and for the severity of what's going on. The first symptoms occur about 7 to 9 days after infection, and you start out feeling very much like you have the flu. You've got a headache, fatigue, fever, and muscle soreness. But very quickly that progresses to very high fever, vomiting blood, and lethargy. Very soon after that, you start getting bruising, brain damage, and this is when a lot of the bleeding starts. That is characteristic and what scares people so much about Ebola. So you have bleeding from the mouth, the nose, the eyes, and the anus. And then finally, before the victim dies, they lose consciousness, they have seizures, there's massive internal bleeding, and then finally death. So it's an extremely gruesome disease and an extremely terrible way to die. Now, here is a map of the current outbreak, and I went onto the CDC website and pulled up a few statistics. The latest statistics in terms of cases were, the latest statistics available were as of October 5th. So as of October 5th, there were just a little bit over 8,000 cases. Lab-confirmed cases were substantially less, but the threshold for lab-confirmed cases is a little bit high, and it also depends on getting the samples to the lab, and there's a lag time for processing. So total number of cases is about 8,000, and the total number of deaths is just under 4,000. So this particular outbreak of Ebola virus is killing almost half of its victims. And you can see here that there are a lot of locations where it's spreading. There are some places where it's not active, and you can even see a few places that are considered new active areas. What's kind of interesting is there are treatment centers that are spread out, but they're few and far between considering the severity of the outbreak. We're going to talk a little bit about transmission and the reservoir of the virus. So the working hypothesis is that the virus uses bats as its reservoir host. So it's very likely not nearly as deadly to bats as it is to humans, and so they can be carriers without the substantial ill effects that you see in human populations. And the way it makes its way to people can be through one of a few ways. One of the ways is that animals that people use as meat come in contact with bats and bat droppings, those types of things. And the people then will come into contact with those animals, or as an example, the first outbreak, likely the person who picked it up directly from going through bat caves on a hike. So once it is transmitted to humans, then the human-to-human transmission is the way that it spreads out through the population. And in fact, they've done a little bit of research, well, they've done a lot of research on the current outbreak of the Ebola virus. And through genetics, they've been able to conclude that this particular outbreak was the result of one transmission from bats to humans, and then from there it spread out to a large number of people. So this is a diagram of the virus itself, and there are a few things that I want to point out. Right down here is the genome of the virus. And notice that it's a negative strand or negative sense RNA genome. So the example of the virus we went through before, remember, was a double-stranded DNA genome. Well, this is a single-stranded negative strand RNA genome. And if you're used to looking at pictures of the representation of genes and genetic material, you'll notice that each of these boxes encodes a gene. And in the Ebola genome, there are 7 genes. So there are only 7 genes in this virus that's causing so much loss of life and brutal deaths. So that's one fact that always floors me, is how few genes many viruses have. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of the virus and what the genes encode. So remember that I was telling you that all viruses contain a capsid, and the capsid is the structure that surrounds and protects the DNA. So what you're seeing here, and what they're calling on this diagram as the nucleoprotein, or N, this is the viral capsid. These are the proteins that protein complexes that protect the DNA. The next component that you'll notice is the cell membrane, or envelope. So the Ebola virus is coated by an envelope. Remember we talked about how some are, some aren't. This one is. And on the surface of this envelope, there are also glycoproteins that are produced by one of the genes here, and scientists are not entirely sure what the glycoproteins do, but they appear to play a role in the virus being able to dock and gain entry into the cell. The virus also encodes its own polymerase, and when the virion particles are packaged up before the newly synthesized viruses are released so that they can go and infect new cells, they actually pack a polymerase along with it. And then there are some other parts of the virus that we're not going to talk about in particular, but that's the basic structure of the Ebola virus. So let's now move into the life cycle of the Ebola, and indeed this is very similar to all negative strand RNA viruses. Now on this slide, what I'm showing you is a figure that I found on the internet that explains how the life cycle of Ebola works. So what I'm going to do is, on the next slide, I'm going to draw that out for you so we can talk about each stage of the life cycle.